Well, joining me now to discuss Cuba further from Miami is Javier Lopez. He is the president of the Cuban-American Bar Association. Also in Miami, we have Sebastian Arcos. He is the associate director of the Cuban Research Institute at Florida International University. And from London, Rob Miller. He is the director of the Cuba Solidarity Campaign. Thanks all so much for joining us. Let me begin with you, Rob, in London there.
Thank you.
First, tell us how much you really believe can change under this new leadership. It's still under the rule of the Communist Party, but can we look forward to a new Cuba of sorts?
Well, I think you're seeing a change in Cuba in the fact that you've got a brand new parliament. The very high number of the new parliamentarians are new to this parliament. 53% of the new members of parliament are women, making it the second highest number of female legislators in the world. And many of them are young, including the likely new president, Miguel Díaz-Canel, who was born after the revolution. So you have a historic shift to a new generation of Cubans who will take Cuba through the next decades, and we shall have to see how things work out. Cuba faces many challenges, as we know at this time, and it will be a very difficult task for the new president and the new National Assembly, to see those changes move forward, certainly in terms of the economy, and in terms of continuing with the positive aspects of their revolution, particularly in health and education, social care, etc., that we all know about.
Okay. Sebastian, are you optimistic?
Yes. No, I am not. We are seeing a very slow and reluctant shift to a new generation, but this is far from a historical moment. This is more of a show to confound the international community with an appearance of meaningful change. This is not meaningful change. This is not a transition. This is continuity. The National Assembly in Cuba is actually using the hashtag continuidad, which is continuity in Spanish. And they should know what they're talking about. Raul Castro is not stepping down from power. He continues to effectively rule the country through his leadership of the two most important institutions in the country, the Communist Party and the military. The handpicked new president owes his power to him and has a little power beyond that.
Okay, Javier, I imagine you're on a similar page as Sebastian.
I'm a little bit of a hybrid. I think that this is smoke and mirrors. You know, we have, for the first time, a leader that's not named Castro. However, President Daz-canel was born, he's only known one leader with the last name of Castro, whether it be Fidel or Raul. And yes, are there new members of parliament? Sure, but I see them as puppets, and the puppeteer is and has always been Castro, whether it be Fidel or now Raul. And the fact that Raul Castro is going to be the head of the Communist Party until 2021, I think speaks volumes. So another point that I think is important is that President Canel is going to be 58 years old tomorrow. He was born post-revolution, so it's the only show in town that he's ever known. So how he could even possibly attempt to try and bring, you know, another point of view where, you know, this is what he's been brainwashed with since the moment he came into existence, is going to be pretty much impossible.
Okay, but Javier, let me ask you. I mean, you can say that very little will change because the leadership is essentially the same under the same party and the same mantra, but the economy will have to change. I mean, you can correct me if you think I'm wrong, but what we're seeing now with dual currencies, this existence of one sort of being pegged to the dollar or euro while the other one is given to Cubans to spend at a 25th of the rate, if I'm not mistaken, that's not sustainable. What's going to happen to the economy then?
No, it's not and hasn't been sustainable for 60 years. The dual monies has been around for quite some time. You know, the CUC or the Cuban dollar has been around. I think something that directly affects the Cuban economy is obviously the United States policy towards Cuba. You saw an opening up of relations with the previous Obama administration, and now the Trump administration is now chilling relations towards Cuba. I mean, you've seen the embassy that was opened, it's now, I think, down to about 10 folks that are over there based on, the attacks that were made on the embassy. Obviously, it hasn't been admitted by the Cuban government, but I think we know what happened there. So, yes, something has to happen with the economy. It's not sustainable. It hasn't been sustainable.
Okay, let's see if we can get to that
And
later.
I think
I want to ask Rob his opinion on that. I mean, particularly in respect to these two parallel currencies, do you fear, Rob, that we could see a return to the economic disaster that Cuba witnessed really throughout the 90s when it lost the support of the Soviet Union and is now losing the support of Venezuela?
No, I don't think you'll see the same situation. Cuba lost over 70% of its economy overnight with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the countries of Eastern Europe, and that is still having massive impact upon the Cuban economy right now. But for people to say it's unsustainable is quite strange from where I'm sitting, and certainly when you go to Havana and you look at the statistics, and at the end of the day we're about people, and if you look at the statistics, Cuba has the best health care system in Latin America, exceeding much of the indices of the United States itself. So, for example, its infant mortality rates are better than the United States itself. Its education levels are the best in Latin America. So while you talk about the economy being unsustainable, there are real achievements, even under that scenario, that the Cuban people are rightly proud of. And if you're a poor person in Latin America, and your children are ill, you look at Cuba and you see that you can get free medical care. If you're a poor person in Latin America and your children want to be scientists or doctors or dancers or artists, and you look at Cuba where children can aspire and achieve those things, you look at Cuba in a very, very different light to how you might look at it perhaps from Miami or Washington. So I think the term unsustainable doesn't really stand up to reality. These aren't my figures or Cuban government figures. These are the World Health Organization and UNESCO figures. So they're the facts, that's the reality. So while can I just finish? While the economy is a very tricky situation, we need to look at some of the underlying reasons why that might be. And one of the biggest ones is the United States blockade of Cuba. Exactly.
Understood.
The most vicious blockade of any country outside of wartime.
It is a factor. I mean, I don't think anyone can deny that. But I mean, Sebastian, I did see you laughing at one point. One of the issues that our reporter brought up in the package prior to this was that Cubans have a good quality of life versus a poor quality of commodities. They can't go out and buy the things that people can buy in the neighboring countries, even Mexico or the US. But at the same time, Cuba, for example, Dominican Republic, right next door, you're looking at 30% of the population there living on $1.25 a day. And I laughed when a German tourist told me that the only difference he sees between the Dominican Republic and Cuba is that the Dominican Republic has horrible traffic and terrible air. I mean, how do you justify that, Cuba's economy is a massive disaster and that the people of Cuba are really suffering when you look at those statistics?
Well, the Cuban economy is a disaster and continues to be a disaster, beginning with the early years of the revolution because of the policies imposed by Fidel Castro himself and the adoption, of course, of the Marxist economic model. The embargo has very little to do and is still used as a red herring to distract attention from the shortcomings of communism and Fidel Castro's leadership. The consequences
why does the United States not end the blockade then?
On the hands of the Castro regime that has been ruling the country for the last 60 years with absolute power. And the dependency of the Cuban economy of that Soviet subsidy became very clear in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cuban economy collapsed 50%. And those achievements that have been mentioned so often about education and healthcare, I am a result of that education system, by the way, collapsed also with the Cuban economy in the 1990s. And that is not the reality that you see in Cuba today. There was a recent poll conducted by a Spanish human rights group inside Cuba, illegal, of course, where 50% of the population earns less than $1 a day. Cuba is in a state of economic crisis, and the government has no realistic plan to fix the economy model that still relies on an outside patron to support the country.
But, I mean, Javier, I'll let you field this then. I mean, how do you explain then that Cubans have such a better standard of living than many of their Latin American counterparts, including right next door in the Caribbean, I'm going to let Javier take this one, including next door in their fellow Caribbean states?
I think that one of the issues with the statistics that Mr. Miller was raising is that, I mean, he said it himself. Where are you getting those statistics from? You're getting them from the Cuban government. This idea that healthcare and education is so wonderful in Cuba is simply a farce. You know, I'm not talking from an ivory tower here in Miami or as a jaded first-generation Cuban American. I have been to Cuba. I went on a mission trip to Cuba, and I saw it for myself. And, you know, I had taxi drivers that were neurosurgeons, taxi drivers that were engineers. Why? Because the average Cuban makes roughly $30 a month. It's unsustainable. So they have to, you know, these brilliant men and women that are, you know,
but Javier,
should be making
can I put to you that might be very frustrating for those people, but it's not the kind of humiliating poverty that's suffered in other developing countries. Is there nothing to be said for that?
Well, when I traveled outside of it, first of all, I saw a lot of poverty in Havana, and when I traveled Cuba, there was, I don't understand, you know, your question about humiliating poverty, but, you know, folks that literally are their entire objective in life is to get up and find where they're going to get their next meal from.
Okay, Sebastian.
That's, you know, it's extreme poverty.
Okay, let me get back to Sebastian there. I mean, the point with the extreme poverty is that, you know, there is a dignity that comes with getting a basic education that in many developing countries children don't get. The level of health is significantly better. Even the World Health Organization doesn't argue with those statistics and in fact supports them. But Sebastian, I know you were trying to interject there. Do go ahead.
Yes, because the World Health Organization and the other UN institutions get their data from the Cuban regime. And of course, it's going to show what the Cuban regime wants to show. My point is very simple. Even if we can define a level of poverty that for Cubans would be sort of honorable compared to the poverty for other Latin American countries, we are still talking about a poverty level that is acceptable because we are willing to accept the total control of a government that prohibits their citizens to exercise their basic fundamental rights. And we're willing to accept that Cubans live comfortably and are happy because they have free health care and education, even if they don't have any of the other rights that other people have.
It's a race to the bottom.
Yeah, we only have a few minutes left, and let me just get back to Rob then quickly on that point specifically. I mean, Rob, why can't Cuba then really have the best of both worlds? If it succeeded so well with its socialist policies and providing all the basics that are necessary to live a dignified life, why can't it just adapt to perhaps the social democracy models of Europe that also provide for their populations with a high standard of living and all the resources necessary, but give them the personal freedoms that they also deserve?
Well, if you talk to Cubans, and I talk to Cubans a lot, and I'll be traveling to Havana, traveling to Havana on Monday, as indeed 200,000 British people travel to Cuba every year on holiday and have a wonderful time. And when you talk to Cubans, they do participate in their elections. 8 million Cubans have participated in this electoral process. It may be very different to the electoral process in the United States or in Britain, but it is an electoral process, and it is a Cuban electoral process, and it's one that the Cuban people participate in. I was on a program with someone from Miami recently who told me there was no democracy in Cuba. At the same time, 6 members of the Cuban parliament were visiting the British Parliament, to meet with British members of Parliament, the mother of all democratic parliaments, I've heard it be called. They were meeting on a par with members of the Cuban Parliament. It is a different system. It's a very different system, but it is a Cuban system. And at the end of the day, it is up to the Cuban people to decide how they determine their country, their government, their way of life and their future. And I would say one thing to the friends in Miami. If you really wanted to help the people of Cuba, which you espouse that you would like to do, then call for the end of the blockade, allow American tourists to travel to Cuba, because it's the only country where American tourists are not allowed to go. They're forbidden by your government from going and seeing Cuba for themselves, and try and end the blockade. Allow Cuba to work itself out. If it fails, fair enough. But at the moment, why is the United States blockading this small Caribbean island? It's a terrible thing, and it needs to change.
Javier, quick final words?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea that Cuba is a democracy is somewhat comical. When you have one candidate, you know, take it or leave it, that's not democracy. And, you know, the day that they have the right for free speech and truly free elections, then we can talk about it. One thing that I somewhat agree with Mr. Miller is this issue of the blockade. Now, I don't think that Cuba's economy is in shambles because of the U.S. Blockade. I think that would be arrogant of us to think that way, because the entire rest of the world engages in economic activity with Cuba.
That's not true.
So, but I do think that it has not worked.
It's an extraterritorial blockade. It affects third countries.
True.
I do believe. I do believe that there's an opportunity now with this quote-unquote new government to try and engage in new dialogue with this new president, because clearly what's happened in the past hasn't worked. So I'm not for the position to just say keep the status quo. I think it is an opportunity that we should try and use that for true democratic change.
Okay, gentlemen, I am so sorry we're over time, and my apologies to Sebastian to not getting a final word from you, but I think your facial expressions did speak volumes, so I appreciate that. Thank you all three of you, so much for joining us on The Newsmakers.